It started as a summer hike through the quiet trails of Blue Ridge National Park, a simple trip that should be ended by sunset. But when 17-year-old Emma Collins never came back, the forest fell silent, holding its secret tight. A month later, she was found under a fallen tree, clutching her boyfriend's blood-stained jacket, and nothing about her story made sense. The morning of June 10, 2019 began like any other in the Blue Ridge Mountains, mist hanging low over the ridges. Sunlight dripping slowly through the canopy, the hum of cicadas already rising from the trees. Emma Collins and her boyfriend, Ryan Porter, pulled into the small gravel parking lot at Cascade Trail, a popular route winding through waterfalls and stone cliffs. Locals often said it was an easy hike, the kind families took on weekends, but that morning the air carried a restless stillness that no one seemed to notice. Emma was 17, just out of her junior year, a quiet girl known for her good grades and calm demeanor. Ryan, 2 years older, worked part-time at a bike shop in Asheville and was the kind of boy parents like to trust, the kind who smiled easily and offered to carry the extra backpack. They had been dating for nearly a year, their relationship steady but marked by the kind of intensity that only young love knows, too much feeling, too little understanding of what to do with it. That day was supposed to be their reset, a day to leave behind the arguments that had crept into their summer. They packed light water, granola bars, a first aid kit, and Ryan's dark green hoodie tied around his waist. Emma's mother remembered her daughter promising to be back by 4. She even joked that if they weren't, she'd drive up there herself and drag them out. It was an empty threat meant with love, but by evening it would echo in her mind like a curse. Several hikers later recalled seeing them near the lower dam around 9:30 that morning, walking side by side. They seemed relaxed, laughing about something, Emma's braid swinging behind her as she stepped carefully over the stones. The ranger who signed them in noted nothing unusual, just another young couple heading out for a summer hike. The weather was perfect, clear skies, light breeze, but the mountains had their own moods. By afternoon, clouds would gather like a slow brewing storm, the kind that turned sunlight into shadow and paths into puzzles. When 4 o'clock came and went, Emma's mother called her phone. It rang twice, then went straight to voicemail. She waited, assuming maybe they'd lost signal. The Blue Ridge was notorious for dead zones. By 5, she was dialing again, pacing the kitchen with a knot growing in her chest. By 6, the car still wasn't in the driveway, and she was calling the park service, her voice trembling as she tried to sound calm. Within the hour, a ranger logged the report of 2 overdue hikers, 1 female, 17, 1 male, 19. By sunset, a search team was already on its way up the trail, thermal cameras scanning the dense undergrowth. The air turned colder, and fog began to creep between the trees, blurring flashlights into thin streaks of white. That night, the mountains swallowed sound. Even the dogs, trained to track human scent through rain and mud, seemed confused. They picked up traces near the dam, followed them up a ridge, then stopped abruptly at a rocky outcrop. The trail simply ended, as if the two had walked off the face of the earth. Over the next 2 days, the search expanded. Rangers, volunteer climbers, divers, they scoured the streams, the cliffs, the ravines where hikers had slipped before. They found nothing. Not a shoe print, not a piece of fabric, not even a broken branch that could have suggested where the couple went. The forest, it seemed, had chosen to keep them. Rain came hard on the 3rd night, washing away what little evidence might have been left. By the time dawn broke, the searchers were soaked, their boots sinking into red clay, their hope fading with each passing hour. Reporters arrived from nearby counties. Missing teens in Blue Ridge, the headline said. Some blamed the unpredictable weather. Others whispered about wild animals or hidden caves. But Emma's mother refused to believe it. She wouldn't leave the trail, she kept saying to anyone who would listen. She's cautious. She knows better. Friends agreed. Emma wasn't impulsive, she wasn't reckless, and yet the forest had erased her as completely as if she'd never existed. By the end of the week, rescue operations turned into recovery efforts. The mood shifted from determined to resigned. Maps were marked with red zones, places already searched and cleared. Still, a handful of volunteers returned every morning, unwilling to give up. They carried with them a small hope, the kind that burns painfully bright even when logic says it shouldn't. One ranger, a veteran of 20 years, later said he'd never seen a disappearance like it. Usually there's something, he told the local paper. A dropped phone, a shoe, a sign of struggle. But this was like they walked into fog and just kept walking until the world forgot them. In the following days, the park grew quiet again. Tourists stopped coming. The trailhead stood empty, the visitor logs thin. Locals began avoiding the area near the falls after dark, muttering about bad luck and restless spirits. Rumors spread stories of lights in the woods, a girl's voice calling faintly from somewhere deep in the canyon. None of it was real, of course, but it gave people a way to explain the unexplainable. And in Blue Ridge, legends filled the space where truth refused to stay. For Emma's family, each sunset became a reminder of everything lost. Her mother kept her phone on the kitchen counter fully charged, waiting for a call that would never come. Ryan's father spent days driving the park roads, scanning the woods, shouting his son's name into silence. The forest never answered. By the third week, even the media moved on. Another story, another tragedy. The official report listed them as presumed deceased. But not everyone was ready to close the book. One of the lead rangers wrote in his private notes that something about the disappearance did not fit any known pattern. He wasn't talking about wild animals or natural hazards, he meant human behavior. Two people don't just vanish from a well-traveled trail without leaving a trace. Something else had happened up there, something no one could see. The final search ended on July 3rd. By then, summer was in full bloom. The same sun that had risen over their hike now burned hot and indifferent over the empty parking lot. Rangers collected the caution tape, folded up their maps, and locked the station for the season. The forest went back to being what it always was: quiet, vast, and full of secrets. No one knew that less than a week later, Blue Ridge would give one of them back. Not in triumph, not in closure, but in silence. A biologist surveying bird populations would stumble upon a fallen pine tree, its roots torn from the earth. Beneath it, half buried in mud and branches, a girl would be sitting motionless, clutching a dark green hoodie. Her lips cracked, her eyes unfocused. And when they asked her what happened, she would whisper the same three words over and over: "He's still there." When Emma's mother, Laura Collins, realized her daughter hadn't come home by dusk, the worry began as a dull ache somewhere deep in her stomach, the kind that mothers learn not to ignore. At first, she told herself the usual things. Maybe they'd lost track of time. Maybe they stopped for dinner on the way back. Maybe the trail took longer than they expected. The sun dipped behind the hills, washing the kitchen in a soft orange light, and she kept glancing at the clock, each minute growing heavier. When she called Emma's phone for the first time, it rang twice, then went straight to voicemail. She tried again, pacing the tile floor, listening to that same hollow message that had never sounded so cruelly calm. By the fourth call, her voice had changed, no longer sharp, but trembling, as if she were trying to reason with someone who wasn't there. Ryan's parents lived 30 miles away in Hendersonville. When Laura called them just after 6:00 p.m., she could hear the confusion turn to fear in Ryan's mother's voice. They were supposed to stop by that evening, she said. Ryan had promised to text. He hadn't. Within an hour, two families were trying to piece together a picture that made less and less sense. The last text Emma had sent that morning was a photo of the trailhead sign, captioned "Made it," cheerful, ordinary, and final. By 7:00, Laura was in her car driving toward the park entrance, her headlights slicing through the dusk. The road wound upward through the pines, each turn sharper than the last, the radio silent except for the static of a lost signal. She told herself that when she reached the parking lot, she'd see Ryan's old Subaru still sitting there. She imagined two silhouettes walking toward her, laughing, apologizing for scaring her. But when she pulled in, the lot was nearly empty, only one Ranger truck parked by the gate and the faint echo of insects rising from the trees. Ryan's car was there, but it was dark inside, keys gone, and the air around it felt too still, too expectant. She flagged down the ranger on duty, a tall man with weathered skin named Tom Avery. He listened quietly as she explained, then glanced at his watch. "Sun sets in 20, he said softly, already pulling a flashlight from the truck. He checked the visitor log. Emma and Ryan had signed in at 9:12 that morning, no sign out. That meant they were still somewhere on the trail, at least according to the book. By regulation, search and rescue wasn't to be launched until several hours after the designated return time. But Avery took one look at the empty parking lot and made a decision that would later be praised as the reason the operation started so fast. He radioed the station, requesting 2 additional rangers and thermal imaging gear. "We've got a possible delay on Cascade Trail," he said, voice clipped but urgent. Weather's turning, we restarting early. As darkness fell, the forest began to shift. The easy warmth of daylight drained away, replaced by cold air rising from the valley. Clouds moved fast, dragging shadows across the treetops. Laura waited near the car, watching beams of light disappear into the woods, each one swallowed by mist. The rangers moved methodically, calling out names, blowing short bursts on their whistles, marking trees with reflective tape. The sound of rushing water from the lower falls mixed with the wind, creating an eerie rhythm that made it hard to tell where the forest ended and the echoes began. By midnight, more help had arrived, local deputies, a canning unit, and volunteers from nearby towns. The dogs caught faint traces of human scent along the first mile of trail, then veered toward the ridge before losing it completely on a slab of granite. The handler reported that the scent just stopped, like someone had lifted the subjects into thin air. It was an unsettling detail that would appear in nearly every search report written later. Rain rolled in just before dawn. Heavy, cold drops fell through the branches, blurring footprints, washing over the chalk markers left by the team. The temperature dropped almost 15 degrees, turning the mud slick and dangerous. At 4 Zodri M. Avery called a halt, his voice wary through the radio. Visibility's gone. We'll regroup at sunrise. Laura sat in the ranger station, wrapped in a blanket someone had handed her, staring at the wet maps spread across the table. No one wanted to say it out loud, but they all knew the longer someone was lost in Blue Ridge, the smaller their chances became. The next morning, search crews expanded the perimeter. Drones scanned the ridgelines, their hums faint against the roaring wind. Helicopters circled above the waterfalls, their spotlights flashing against the cliffs. Volunteers combed the riverbanks, shouting names into the void. The sound never carried far, the forest swallowed it whole. After 36 hours, the operation turned from hopeful to grim. Every hiker who had been on the trail that day was interviewed, but no one remembered seeing anything strange. A couple had mentioned hearing a single scream near noon, distant and short-lived, but they couldn't tell if it came from a human or an animal. As the days blurred together, the search evolved into routine: wake before dawn, brief climb, search, return empty-handed. Coffee cups piled up on the station tables. Maps grew dense with red lines and circles, places already scarred and ruled out. News vans parked at the park entrance, reporters asking the same questions over and over. Any progress? Any new leads? There were none. Emma and Ryan had vanished without a trace, and no one could explain how. By the fifth night, the emotional strain began to show. Laura refused to leave, sleeping in her car near the station. Ryan's father stayed beside the rangers, insisting on joining the next day's search despite the rough terrain. One of the volunteers, a retired fireman, said later that he'd never forget the look in their eyes, not anger, not hope, but something colder, a kind of numb determination. As the operation dragged into the weekend, the weather turned worse. A thunderstorm swept across the mountains, knocking down branches and flooding small creeks. The rain turned the trails to sludge, forcing teams to pull back for safety. It was then that the first official statement went out to the press: search efforts continue for 2 missing hikers believed to be somewhere within the Blue Ridge National Park boundaries. The wording was cautious, almost clinical, but everyone understood what it meant. They were running out of time. Late that night, when the last team returned, Avery stood outside the station, drenched, staring into the dark line of trees. He'd been part of dozens of rescues in his career: lost campers, broken ankles, even a few drownings, but nothing like this. He told a colleague, "It's like they walked through a door we can't see." That phrase would later make its way into local legend, quoted by newspapers and true crime forums alike. Meanwhile, Laura sat in her car again, engine off, the world around her quiet except for the rain on the windshield. She replayed every moment of that morning, Emma laughing, packing sunscreen, waving from the door. She kept thinking of something her daughter had said a week earlier, offhandedly: "You ever feel like the woods are alive?" Like they were listening. It hadn't meant anything then. Now, in the silence, it meant everything. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but the search was no closer to an answer. The forest stood untouched, patient, as if mocking the humans who tried to understand it. The dogs refused to track further past the granite outcrop, circling the same patch of ground where the scent had vanished. Forensics teams scanned the area, but the soil told no story. No blood, no fabric, no sign of struggle. It was as though the earth itself had erased them. At 8:30 a.m., Avery called the families into the ranger office. His voice was calm, practiced, but his eyes betrayed the exhaustion. "We were not giving up," he said, "but we have to scale back until the weather clears." Laura nodded, though she barely heard him. Outside, the clouds began to lift, revealing the endless sweep of mountains beyond. Somewhere out there, she thought her daughter was waiting, maybe hurt, maybe hiding, maybe worse. What she didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that the truth wasn't buried under roots or rocks. It was walking somewhere between guilt and fear, alive, watching, and still clutching a dark green jacket that would soon tell the real story. The morning after the storm, the forest looked cleansed, but in a way that felt wrong. Mist coiled around the trees like something alive, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine sap. The search teams regrouped at first light, their boots sinking into the soaked ground, their radios crackling faintly in the damp air. By now, more than 40 people were involved: rangers, volunteers, professional climbers, and 2K9 units borrowed from Buncombe County. The command post outside the ranger station looked like a military base, maps pinned to walls, thermos cups scattered across tables. The constant shuffle of paperwork and muted voices trying to organize chaos. Every time a new report came in, it said the same thing: nothing found, no footprints, no torn fabric, no signal from their phones. It was as if Emma Collins and Ryan Porter had walked off the edge of the world. When the dogs were brought in again that morning, their handlers led them to the last confirmed point of contact, the stretch of trail near the upper dam, where a witness had seen the couple around 9:30. The scent picked up easily at first. Both dogs followed the same direction, tails stiff, noses low, leading the team toward the ridge. For half a mile, the handlers were confident they were close to something. But then, just beyond a rocky bend overlooking the falls, the dogs stopped. One began to circle, whining, nose pressed to the ground. The other sat down, completely confused. The scent trail had simply ended. The handler tried again, bringing the dogs back to the last solid point, but each time they reached that same spot, it was as if the trail dissolved into air. "It's unstable," the handler told the ranger, "like they were walking here and then nothing." It wasn't the first time he'd seen this behavior, but never in a place like Blue Ridge, where the terrain left little room for mystery. Searchers began widening the perimeter, moving down into the gorge where the waterfalls fed into a narrow stream. Divers entered the cold water in wetsuits, their flashlights cutting pale beams through the current. The rocks were slick, the water fast, and the sound of it drowned out their voices. They found no sign of clothing or equipment, no torn backpack strap, no fragments of gear. The divers surfaced one by one, shaking their heads, their faces pale with exhaustion. "If they fell," one of them said, "we'd have something. Something always stays behind." But there was nothing. The higher they climbed, the worse the conditions became. After the storm, the soil had loosened, and parts of the trail crumbled underfoot. The cliffs that bordered Cascade Trail weren't particularly tall, but they were steep enough to kill. Rangers roped off sections and descended carefully into crevices that could have hidden a body. They found fallen branches, stones, and animal tracks, but no human trace. Each site was marked, photographed, and logged, but the reports were repetitive, mechanical, hopelessly empty. By the third day, exhaustion had turned to quiet frustration. The volunteers began muttering among themselves about the dead zone, the stretch of trail where the dogs had lost the scent. It made no sense. Some suggested that maybe the pair had taken an unmarked side path. Others speculated about a sudden fall into one of the countless fissures hidden beneath the ferns. But even then, there should have been evidence: blood, scraps of fabric, something. Ranger Avery didn't like to admit it, but the case was beginning to feel wrong in ways he couldn't explain. He'd worked Blue Ridge for 2 decades. He'd seen hikers vanish, yes, but never 2 at once, and never this cleanly. By May 13th, the media was camped at the park entrance. Satellite vans lined the gravel road, and every reporter wanted the same shot: the dense wall of trees that had swallowed the couple whole. Press conferences were brief and scripted. The rangers repeated the facts. The search continued. Weather was improving. All resources were being used. They didn't mention the unease creeping through the team, or how the forest seemed to reject their efforts. Searchers spoke quietly at night about strange sounds echoing through the trees, short bursts, like someone calling, then gone. One man swore he'd seen a light flicker deep between the trunks, though no one could find its source when they went to check. The families came each morning, waiting at the base camp for news that never came. Laura Collins barely slept, her face drawn and pale. Ryan's father tried to hide his anger behind composure, but sometimes he'd pace the gravel until the rangers made him sit down. At night, they stayed in their cars, staring at the tree line. The forest loomed like a black ocean, endless and impenetrable. By day 4, more than 10 miles had been searched, every cave, ravine, and waterway within reach. Helicopters flew overhead, their blades chopping the silence into mechanical rhythm. Nothing. The official reports began to sound identical, same terrain, same negative results. When rain returned that evening, it was almost a relief. At least the weather could take the blame. But the truth was simpler. They had run out of places to look. Avery gathered his senior rangers for a late-night meeting. The air in the room was heavy with coffee and fatigue. He pointed at the map where the scent had vanished. "This is the only constant," he said. "Every trail loops back here." One of the climbers, a young man named Jeff, suggested expanding the search beyond the official trail system, into the restricted logging roads farther north. Avery hesitated. Those areas were unstable, unmaintained, full of old mining shafts, but he agreed. "We'll start there at first light." That decision extended the search another 3 days, pulling in mountain rescue specialists from neighboring counties. They brought ropes, drones, and thermal cameras capable of seeing through dense foliage. The deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. The trees grew closer together, the ground cluttered with decades of fallen timber. Even the peace units struggled to hold signal. When one team reached an area known as Devil's Hollow, a narrow ravine carved between slate cliffs, they found signs of recent rock slides. It looked as though the earth itself had shifted, closing old paths and opening new ones. Still, no evidence of the missing hikers. At the end of the week, Avery made the hardest call of his career. He suspended the active search. The decision was met with silence, then anger. Lara shouted that he was giving up on her daughter. Ryan's mother wept quietly, holding a photo of her son that the wind kept trying to snatch away. But Avery had no choice. The mountain's done talking, he told them. If we push further, someone else will get hurt. Officially, the reason listed in the report was hazardous conditions and depleted resources. Unofficially, everyone knew it meant one thing: there was nothing left to find. The press statement that evening was brief. The Park Service thanked the volunteers and promised to keep investigating possible leads. No one believed there would be any. The next morning, the last of the search crews packed their gear, leaving behind only a few yellow flags marking where the trail had ended. The forest swallowed those two within days. For the locals, the disappearance became a story told in lowered voices. Parents warned their kids not to wander off the main path. Hikers left small offerings, ribbons, stones, wildflowers at the trailhead, a silent plea to whatever ruled the woods to give the missing back. Some nights, a few swore they heard faint music in the distance, or saw a single light moving between the trees, slow and deliberate, like a lantern. But the forest never gave answers, only echoes, and while the rest of the world moved on, Blue Ridge kept it secret. The truth, as it would later turn out, wasn't that the mountain had claimed them, but that one of them had never truly left it at all. By the time the 4th week passed, the Blue Ridge search had turned from a rescue mission into something quieter, almost ceremonial. The park rangers still went through the motions, briefings at dawn, coordinates read over the radio, boots crunching through the undergrowth, but the urgency had faded. Hope had thinned to routine. The media had long since moved on to other stories, the volunteers had returned to their towns, and the command center had shrunk to a skeleton crew of wary men who knew the odds. The maps on the walls were now marked not with routes to explore, but with boundaries of failure, red ink slashed across sections labeled cleared, inaccessible, or simply nothing. The rain came again on the first day of July, washing over the empty parking lot where Ryan's Subaru still sat behind the ranger station. The car had become a symbol, a small shrine of sorts. People occasionally left flowers or notes on the windshield, faded photos tucked under the wipers. A pair of hikers left a folded paper crane. Someone else tied a ribbon to the side mirror, its color now bleached by the sun. The sight of it, fluttering weakly in the breeze, broke something in Laura Collins every time she came to check. She couldn't stay away. Each evening she drove up the mountain, parked beside that car, and waited until the last hint of daylight faded. She said it made her feel close to Emma, as though her daughter might step out from the trees at any moment, apologetic and smiling, saying it was all just a mistake. The rangers tried to persuade her to rest, to go home, but she wouldn't. Ryan's parents came less often now. They had other children to think of, other lives to protect, but Laura had nothing else left to anchor her. Her husband had passed away years before, and Emma was her only child. Every morning she packed a thermos of coffee, a blanket, and a flashlight, then drove up the winding road through the pines. She learned the faces of every ranger by name, started bringing them muffins from the diner in town. Small gestures of gratitude for a search that everyone knew was over. Even the park itself seemed to sense the change. The trails grew over with fresh ferns and vines. The caution tape frayed and fell away. The forest had begun reclaiming what had been disturbed, erasing boot prints, burying broken branches beneath new leaves. At night, when the wind passed through the canopy, it made a low sound like breathing. Locals said the mountain was healing, that whatever had taken the young couple had gone quiet again, satisfied. But to the families, the silence was unbearable. It wasn't peace, it was a taunt. Rumors began to bloom in the nearby towns. Some claimed the area was cursed, that Blue Ridge had always been a place that kept what it wanted. An old man who lived near the northern boundary swore he'd seen lights moving in the woods long after the search ended, small, flickering shapes like flashlights weaving between the trees. Others spoke of hearing faint voices at night, a girl's cry, a boy's laughter cut short. None of it was confirmed, but the stories fed each other like dry kindling. Soon people began avoiding Cascade Trail altogether. The parking lot emptied. The visitor log stayed blank. Inside the ranger station, the remaining crew continued their analysis, hoping to find something in the data they'd missed before. They reviewed the peace logs of every volunteer, cross-referenced drone footage, and compared water flow rates from the dam to estimate whether the bodies could have been carried downstream. Nothing fit. The hydrologist confirmed that if the pair had fallen into the river that day, at least one body would be surfaced by now. There were no signs of animal predation, either no torn clothing, no scattered remains. The official term written in the report was inconclusive disappearance. Off the record, the rangers called it what it really was, a ghost case. On July 5th, Avery sat alone at his desk, the glow of the lamp painting half his face in shadow. The room smelled of rain and paper. He read through his notes one more time, each entry a fragment of confusion. Trail ends abruptly. No secondary prints. Canines lose scent mid-path. The pattern made no sense, but something in his gut refused to let it go. He turned to the map pinned on the wall, tracing his finger over the familiar lines of the Cascade Trail. His eyes stopped at the ridge where the scent had vanished. A cluster of question marks marked the area. For reasons he couldn't explain, he circled it again. That night, when he drove home through the fog, the forest pressed close on both sides of the road. He kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see a figure standing there, just beyond the headlights. The Blue Ridge had a way of getting under people's skin, whispering questions that couldn't be answered, turning reason into superstition. He told himself he was just tired, or that it was the stress, the lack of sleep. But still, he couldn't shake the image of that empty trail, of footprints ending mid-step as though the world itself had swallowed them whole. By the second week of July, the official investigation was winding down. The state authorities had withdrawn their teams, leaving only a small local unit to monitor the area in case of new evidence. The paperwork piled up, ready to be sent to archives where it would gather dust. It was a bitter end for everyone involved. No closure, no explanations, only the echo of questions that grew colder with time. Then came the moment that would change everything. On July 11th, a group of wildlife biologists entered a restricted section of the park to record bird populations affected by the recent storms. The area was dense and dangerous, full of fallen trees and tangled roots far from any marked trail. Around mid-morning, one of them heard a sound that didn't belong, a slow and even breathing, almost like someone trying not to cry. They followed it cautiously, thinking they'd find an injured animal. Instead, they found her. Emma Collins was sitting beneath the roots of a massive fallen oak, her clothes torn, her skin streaked with mud. She didn't react when they called her name, didn't even look up until one of them knelt beside her. In her hand, she clutched a dark green hoodie, its sleeves stiff with dried mud and something darker. Her lips were cracked, her eyes unfocused. The biologist tried to speak to her, to ask where she'd been, but the only words she whispered were, "Don't take it away. Please don't take it." Within minutes, rangers arrived on scene. They wrapped her in a thermal blanket and carried her out on a stretcher, the forest around them deadly quiet. Avery was there when they brought her into the clearing. For a long moment, no one said anything. After a month of silence, the mountain had finally given something back, but it wasn't an answer. It was a girl holding onto a dead man's jacket, and a story no one yet knew how to believe. Word of the discovery spread fast. The media returned overnight, camped outside the hospital where Emma was taken. Reporters called it a miracle, a survival against all odds. But the rescuers who'd seen her knew better. There was something off about the way she moved, the way she stared through people rather than at them. She looked alive, yes, but not like someone who'd been saved. She looked like someone who'd seen something in the woods that wouldn't let her go. And while the world called her lucky, the rangers who found her couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. That Blue Ridge still had one more secret buried in its depths, waiting to be unearthed. The forest had fallen silent again, but silence in those mountains never meant peace. It meant something else was listening. When the biologists radioed in that they'd found a girl under a fallen oak, Ranger Tom Avery thought he'd misheard. After a month of scanning valleys and cliff faces, of combing creeks that turned up nothing but rainwater and silence, those words didn't sound real. But by the time he reached the coordinates, he saw the cluster of people gathered around the base of a massive tree, its roots jutting from the ground like blackened ribs. The air smelled of wet bark and soil. A woman in a khaki jacket waved him over, her face pale. "She's alive," she whispered, almost in disbelief. Emma Collins sat wedged between the roots, knees pulled to her chest. Her hair hung in tangled ropes, and her skin had that gray pallor of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. She blinked slowly, like she was trying to remember how to move. Avery crouched near her, careful not to startle her, but her eyes didn't seem to recognize him or anyone else. She wasn't crying, she wasn't shaking. She was just still. The only movement came from her hands, which clutched a dark green hoodie so tightly that her knuckles were white. The fabric was stiff, crusted with mud and streaks of something darker that Avery didn't want to name yet. The biologists had wrapped her in a tarp before the rangers arrived, but she'd refused to let them touch the jacket. Every time someone reached for it, she jerked back with surprising strength, whispering something they couldn't understand. When Avery leaned closer, he caught fragments. "Don't take it. He needs it. He's cold." Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but filled with terror, as if letting go would mean losing something vital. Avery exchanged glances with the paramedic. They both knew trauma when they saw it, but this was different. There was no blood on her, no sign of a struggle or serious injury. Just exhaustion and fear so deep it seemed to hollow her out from the inside. They carried her out on a stretcher, the forest crowding around them, branches scraping against their shoulders as if reluctant to let her go. The helicopter couldn't land near the site, so they hiked half a mile to the clearing by the old logging road. The whole time Emma stayed silent, her eyes half open but unfocused. She didn't ask where she was going. She didn't ask about Ryan. Only once, as they were loading her into the vehicle, did she whisper something that made Avery stop in his tracks. "He's still out there," she said. "He's waiting for me." At the hospital in Waynesboro, the staff moved quickly of fluids, vitals, blankets. The attending physician, Dr. Lang, wrote in his preliminary report that Emma showed signs of moderate dehydration and caloric deficit, but no critical organ failure. In other words, she hadn't been starving, not really. Her body told a story that didn't match a month lost in the wilderness. Her hands were scratched, but not raw. Her feet, though dirty, had no severe blisters. She wasn't emaciated, just thin, like someone who'd been skipping meals but not dying. Lang had treated survivors of genuine isolation before, and this wasn't that. When Avery came to check on her that evening, she was sitting upright in bed, staring at the window. The sun was setting outside, bathing the room in orange light. She looked fragile against the glow, almost translucent. He tried to talk gently, asking if she remembered what happened, if she knew where Ryan was. Her gaze flicked toward him, then down to the hoodie folded neatly in her lap. "He gave it to me," she murmured. "He said it would keep me safe." Her fingers traced the fabric as if it were sacred. Avery noticed the dried stains again, deep reddish-brown, soaked into the seams. Outside the hospital, the world erupted. News vans arrived within hours, anchors breathlessly calling it a miracle rescue. Photos of Emma's yearbook pictures spread across every screen. Missing girl found alive after 31 days in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Reporters stood in front of the park gates, microphones trembling in the wind. They didn't know the details yet, but that didn't matter. Survival stories always sold. No one cared that Ryan Porter was still missing, not yet. Inside, the doctors were less celebratory. They ran blood work, checked for infections, but their real concern was psychological. The hospital brought in a trauma specialist, Gwen Hardy, who'd worked with kidnap survivors. Her first session with Emma lasted barely 15 minutes before Hardy stepped out into the hallway, shaken. She's terrified of something, she told Avery, not of us, but of going back. She keeps asking if the forest knows where she is. Hardy said Emma's speech was fragmented, her memory patchy. Whenever asked about the time she was missing, she'd go silent or repeat the same line, "He wouldn't let me leave." They assumed she was talking about Ryan at first. Maybe he'd gotten hurt, maybe something had happened between them, but her tone didn't fit grief. It was closer to dread. When Hardy pressed for more, Emma described a man she'd seen watching from the trees, someone who'd followed them off the main trail. He lived there, she whispered. He knew the woods. He didn't want anyone else in them. She said the man attacked Ryan and took her somewhere underground, a hollow space beneath a tree. Her description was disjointed, surreal, full of gaps that didn't line up. Still, the idea of a predator in the park spread fast through law enforcement. Within 24 hours, Cascade Trail was sealed off. Armed patrols scoured the area, searching for evidence of a hideout or the hermit Emma described. Every ranger, every deputy combed the map for unmarked paths, forgotten hunting cabins, anything that could match her story. Nothing turned up. There were no tracks, no campsites, no sign that anyone other than the search teams had been there in months. The only thing they did find, deep near the fallen oak, was the tarp she'd been wrapped in, a filthy, weathered sheet that didn't belong to any park inventory. That discovery, though odd, offered little clarity. The tarp could have been there for years, debris from an old campsite. Still, it fed the growing myth. Avery stayed in contact with Hardy, hoping the girl's memory would sharpen with rest. But each time they spoke, Emma's account changed slightly, small details shifting like shadows in candlelight. One day she said the man never spoke. The next, she insisted he whispered to her at night, asking her to stay quiet so the forest wouldn't wake. She described eating little, drinking from puddles, sleeping under branches. Yet she couldn't explain how she survived the cold nights without shelter, or why she showed no frostbite. The contradictions piled up, and with each one, Avery's unease deepened. He reviewed the photos taken at the discovery site, Emma sitting beneath the oak, her eyes vacant, that hoodie clutched like a lifeline. It didn't feel like the aftermath of an abduction. It felt like someone waiting, someone guarding something. The blood on the fabric had been sent for DNA testing, but the results hadn't come back yet. He didn't want to imagine what they'd find. By the third day, Emma was stable enough to walk short distances. She still refused to be separated from the hoodie. Nurses tried once to wash it. She screamed until they gave it back. "It's his," she said through tears. "He's cold without it." Hardy noted this fixation in her report, calling it a severe attachment response linked to trauma. Avery, though, wondered if it was something simpler, guilt maybe, or denial. He'd seen survivors cling to objects before, but never with this kind of desperation. It was as if she believed the jacket itself could protect her from the truth waiting just beyond the hospital walls. That night, Avery sat in his truck outside the hospital, watching reporters pack up their gear. The air was thick with humidity and the buzz of floodlights. Somewhere inside that building, the girl who had once vanished into the woods was sleeping or pretending to. He thought about what she'd said about someone still out there. He wanted to believe her. It would have been easier than the alternative, that whatever happened in those woods didn't come from a stranger, but from the space between love, fear, and the human need to survive. He started the engine, the headlights cutting through the dark road ahead. Behind him, the hospital windows glowed faintly in the distance. In one of those rooms, a 17-year-old girl held onto a dead man's jacket as if it could still keep her safe. And in the mountains beyond, the forest listened, silent and patient, as if waiting for her to tell the rest of the story. In the days that followed Emma Collins's miraculous reappearance, the hospital became a fortress of whispers. Reporters lingered at the entrance, volunteers who'd once searched the woods stopped by with flowers, and people from town stood in silence outside her window, as if waiting for a sign of what she'd endured. Inside, though, the mood was far from triumphant. The doctors, the rangers, even the detectives assigned to her case all shared the same quiet unease. Something about the story didn't fit. Emma was alive, yes, but alive in a way that raised more questions than it answered. Her body showed the faint wear of exposure, yet her muscles hadn't deteriorated, her skin wasn't blistered, and her pulse, though weak at first, had stabilized far too quickly for someone who had supposedly spent 30 days lost in the wilderness. It was as if she'd disappeared from the world, but not from the comfort of food, water, or shelter. The first real attempt to talk to her took place on July 12th, 2 days after her discovery. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain-soaked pine. Someone had left the window open to let in the cool morning air. Detective Marla Jensen from the county's missing persons unit entered quietly, followed by Avery and a nurse. Emma was sitting up, hair freshly washed but still tangled, the green hoodie folded neatly beside her on the bed. Her eyes tracked them without expression. Jensen introduced herself, speaking softly as though addressing a child who'd just woken from a long sleep. Emma didn't answer at first. She only pressed her hand to the fabric of the hoodie, her fingers trembling slightly. When Jensen asked if she remembered what had happened, Emma finally spoke. "He found us." It was the first sentence anyone had heard from her that wasn't a whisper. Her voice cracked on the second word, dry and even. She went on to describe a man she claimed had emerged from the woods while she and Ryan were exploring a rocky ledge off the main trail. He was barefoot, she said, and he didn't want us there. She spoke in fragments, like someone trying to recall a nightmare through fog. He hit Ryan, he fell, then everything went dark. Jensen asked if she'd try to run, if the man had said anything. Emma shook her head. He didn't talk, he just watched. As she spoke, the nurse noticed her pulse quicken, her breathing shallow. Avery stepped back, letting Jensen continue. "What happened after that?" the detective asked. Emma's eyes drifted toward the window. "He took me somewhere under the ground. It smelled like dirt and smoke. There was a hole in the tree, and I could hear the rain. The words came slow, disjointed. He tied my hands. He said if I screamed, the woods would come alive." The room went silent. Jensen scribbled notes, though she could already sense the inconsistencies piling up. If Emma had been restrained that long, where were the marks? There were none. Her wrists were clean, the skin unbroken. Hardy, the trauma specialist who'd been observing from the doorway, frowned slightly. She'd worked enough kidnapping cases to know that memories could fracture under fear, twisting real moments into distorted ones. Maybe Emma was confusing the isolation with captivity. Maybe the man was a manifestation of panic. But even that didn't explain her calm, her eerie composure as she recounted it. Over the next few days, Emma repeated the same story to each visitor, though details shifted each time. Sometimes the man was old, sometimes middle-aged. Sometimes he was silent, other times he hummed at night. When detectives asked if he'd ever left her alone, she hesitated. Sometimes, she said finally, when he went to find food. That part caught Avery's attention. He remembered the food wrappers found near the site, energy bars and bottled water not sold inside the park. The implication was clear: someone had been supplying her, or she had gone to get them herself. Still, they played along, asking what kind of food he brought. She looked down, murmuring, "The kind hikers eat." While the story captivated the public, the police were less convinced. They dispatched search teams into the restricted zones again, this time with armed escorts. They found nothing resembling a dugout or underground shelter. No rope fibers, no personal belongings, no footprints beyond those from the original rescue. The more they searched, the less sense Emma's tale made. Yet each new contradiction only seemed to push her deeper into silence. When Jensen gently told her that no evidence of a forest man had been found, Emma simply whispered, "You're not looking in the right places." The doctors noted her erratic sleep patterns, long stretches of stillness broken by sudden bursts of panic. Nurses reported hearing her mumble in her sleep, repeating fragments of sentences. "He's still watching, don't go near the rocks, he knows the trees." Each time they woke her, she'd stare at them in confusion, then ask what day it was, as if time no longer followed rules she understood. Hardy diagnosed her with acute stress reaction and recommended limited questioning, but the detectives had no choice. They needed answers, especially with Ryan Porter still missing. On the evening of July 14th, Emma agreed to one last interview before being transferred to a long-term care facility. This time, Avery sat beside her. He'd spent weeks searching for the girl, and now, sitting close enough to hear her shallow breaths, he realized he didn't feel relief, only dread. "Emma," he said quietly, "when you were found, you were holding this jacket. Whose is it?" She looked down at the fabric, tracing the frayed seam near the cuff. "Ryan's," she said. "He was cold, so I kept it safe." Avery nodded slowly. "Was he with you when the man took you?" Her face tightened. "He was there. Then he wasn't." When pressed, she added something new. "He didn't die. I can feel him when I wear it." Her tone was flat, emotionless, as though she were stating a fact. "Sometimes he talks when it's quiet. He says not to go back." Avery felt the hairs rise on his arms. Hardy leaned forward, careful not to challenge her. "You mean you hear his voice?" Emma blinked once. "No, I just know what he wants." By the time the session ended, everyone in the room was unsettled. Hardy insisted on stopping all further interviews. "She's retreating into delusion," she warned. "If you push harder, she'll break." But Avery couldn't shake the feeling that Emma wasn't imagining things. She was hiding something. Whether it was guilt or fear, he didn't know. Outside her room, the hospital hallway was lined with camera crews hoping for a glimpse of the girl who survived the woods. The world had already decided what she was: a victim, a miracle, a symbol of endurance. But the people closest to the case saw something else: the way she avoided mirrors, the way she flinched when the window blinds moved, the way she whispered under her breath when no one was supposed to be listening. On the 5th night after her rescue, the weather turned again. Storm clouds rolled in from the west, and thunder echoed over the valley. Nurses making rounds found Emma awake, sitting cross-legged on the bed, staring out at the rain. The hoodie was draped over her shoulders, damp from her hands. When one of them asked if she was all right, Emma smiled faintly, a thin, ghostly curve of the lips. "He's out there," she said. "He doesn't like the thunder." The nurse reported the incident, but by morning Emma was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. The doctors called it a post-traumatic episode. Avery called it something else, a reminder that the forest still hadn't finished speaking. He didn't know yet that the truth of what Emma carried, the blood woven into that green fabric, would soon unravel the entire story and turn the miracle girl into the center of something far darker than anyone had imagined. In the calm that followed the storm, Blue Ridge sat beneath a heavy silence once more. The trees stood motionless, the trail slick with rain, as though the mountain itself was listening. And somewhere deep inside that silence, between the roots and the rocks where sunlight rarely reached, a secret waited, patient and untouched, because the forest never forgets what it's forced to keep. The morning the press learned Emma had spoken about the man in the woods, Blue Ridge changed overnight. Patrol cars lined the park entrance again, reporters filled every motel within 20 miles, and television anchors broadcast live from the same trailhead that had gone silent only weeks before. They called it the Blue Ridge captive case. Words like abduction and survival floated across the screens, paired with grainy photos of Emma taken through the hospital window, her face pale, eyes wide, a figure half hidden by the curtain. The world wanted a monster, and Emma's story had given them one. Inside the sheriff's office, however, the atmosphere was more tense than triumphant. Detective Marla Jensen stood before a whiteboard crowded with maps and red string. On one side was Emma's timeline. On the other, every known path and access road leading into the restricted zones of the park. "She says he dragged her off the main trail," Jensen said, tapping a marker against the map. "But we've already searched that sector twice. There's nothing there. No dugout, no campsite, no evidence of long-term habitation." Her partner, a younger officer named Grant, shrugged. "Maybe he moved her. She said he knew the forest. Maybe he covered his tracks." Jensen frowned. "Or maybe the story's not true." Avery, sitting quietly near the window, didn't say anything. He'd spent too many nights in those woods to dismiss any possibility. But even he couldn't explain how someone could build a shelter underground, keep a girl hidden for a month, and leave no trace, not a footprint, not a scrap of cloth, not a single tool. Still, the department had to act. By noon, the search for the so-called forest man had begun. Rangers and deputies armed with rifles and flashlights combed through every overgrown path, shouting warnings into the trees. Drone teams were deployed to scan for heat signatures. A temporary command post was established at the old ranger cabin 3 miles north of Cascade Trail, and from there, officers fanned out in all directions. For 48 hours they found nothing but the sounds of their own breathing. The forest, as always, kept its secrets. When they returned empty-handed, suspicion began to turn inward. Jensen ordered the forensics team to analyze every item collected from the site, where Emma was found, the tarp, the soil samples, and most importantly, The hoodie. The lab results wouldn't be ready for days. But preliminary analysis already hinted at something strange. The fibers of the tarp didn't match any standard issue material from park maintenance. And there were no fingerprints besides Emma's. Whatever it was, it had been in the woods for a long time. Back in the hospital, Emma's world was shrinking. The doctors limited her interactions to short sessions. Hardy wanted to protect her from overexposure, but there was another reason too. The more Emma talked, the less sense she made. She began to describe the man in more detail, though never consistently. Sometimes he was tall, sometimes short. Sometimes his face was covered in dirt, sometimes in shadow. But always, she said, his eyes looked wrong. When Hardy asked what she meant, Emma replied, they weren't angry, just empty, like he wasn't really there. Her testimony drew immediate attention from the FBI, who sent agents to consult on the case. They'd handled survival kidnappings before, but rarely in a place as remote as Blue Ridge. Their first step was to test the plausibility of her account. If she had been held underground for 30 days, she would have suffered severe vitamin deficiency, muscle atrophy, and potential respiratory damage. Yet none of those conditions showed up in her medical results. She was weak, yes, but not catastrophically so. Her blood work showed trace amounts of processed food and bottled water, substances that would have required regular access to supplies. When they asked if the man fed her, Emma said he brought her things hikers left behind. That answer only deepened the confusion. Meanwhile, Avery couldn't stop replaying their first conversation in his head. The way she'd whispered he's still out there had embedded itself under his skin. He started visiting the site where she'd been found, standing among the twisted roots and imagining her sitting there in the dark. He thought about the tarp, about how the roots had grown around it, as if time itself had folded over the place. Sometimes, in the stillness, he could swear he heard faint movement deeper in the forest, a crack of a branch, a breath that wasn't his. He knew it was probably wind, but it never quite sounded like that. The official narrative, though shaky, took shape. According to Emma's statement, she and Ryan had strayed from the main path to explore the rocky outcroppings near the falls. There, a stranger had confronted them, claiming they were trespassing on his land. She said Ryan tried to talk him down, but the man struck him with a rock. She didn't see him fall, only heard the sound of impact. The man then dragged her into the woods, forcing her to follow him barefoot through mud and ferns. He knew where to step, she said, so he didn't leave prints. From there, her memory became fragmented. She described being kept in a hollow beneath a tree, covered in boards and branches. She claimed she was tied but couldn't say with what. She said he checked on her when the sun went away and fed her occasionally, warning that if she ran, the woods would finish what he started. Jensen wrote everything down, but even as she did, she could see the inconsistencies forming. Emma couldn't explain how she drank water, where she used the bathroom, or how she survived the cold nights without a blanket. When asked how she escaped, she said she chewed through her bindings while he slept. But her wrist bore no marks, no cuts, no scars, not even faint bruises. The sheriff held a press conference that evening, promising the public that authorities were actively pursuing leads in connection to a potential abduction. Reporters cheered the phrasing. It confirmed the horror story they wanted. For the families, though, the words offered no comfort. Ryan Porter's parents stood beside Laura Collins, faces pale under the harsh lights. "Where is our son?" his father demanded. The sheriff gave the same practiced answer, "We are doing everything we can." But his eyes betrayed the truth he didn't know. That night, Avery couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk reading over Emma's file. One sentence from her interview caught his attention. He didn't want anyone else in the woods. The phrase felt too specific to dismiss. He began researching unsolved cases in the region, combing through records of missing hikers, hermit sightings, illegal squatters. Over the past decade, there had been several reports of strange encounters, campers claiming to see figures watching them at night, or finding food missing from their supplies. Most were dismissed as folklore, but one report stood out 2 years prior. A hunter had filed a complaint about someone stealing his traps near Devil's Hollow. The description was vague, thin, barefoot, smelled of smoke, but it was the first tangible thread Avery had found. He returned to the hospital the next morning, bringing Hardy with him. Emma was awake, sitting cross-legged on the bed, humming softly to herself. The hoodie was draped across her lap. Avery asked if the man ever spoke his name. She hesitated, then whispered, "He didn't have one." Hardy leaned forward. "Did he hurt you?" A pause. Not like that, Emma said. He just didn't want me to leave. Her eyes lifted toward the ceiling. He said the forest keeps what it's given. The word sent a chill through Avery. It was the same phrase one of the old rangers used to say back when he first joined the service, half-jokingly, about how Blue Ridge never gave back what it took. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe not. By the end of that week, the investigation had hit a wall. No trace of a kidnapper, no sign of Ryan. The only solid evidence was a girl who couldn't stop clutching a blood-stained hoodie and a story that shifted every time she told it. But the thing that haunted Avery most wasn't her lies, it was her eyes. There was something in them, something deep and hollow, that made him think of the woods after dark, quiet, endless, and hiding more than it ever revealed. And as he drove back through the mountains that night, headlights slicing the mist, he couldn't help glancing into the trees, half expecting to see a shape watching from between the trunks. Maybe it was imagination, or maybe, as Emma had said, the forest really did keep what it was given and it wasn't finished taking. By the time the first week after Emma's discovery ended, the story had already begun to collapse under its own weight. What had once sounded like the perfect tale of survival, young girl kidnapped by a mysterious hermit, found alive a month later, was now fraying at every seam. The police had combed every square mile of forest she'd described, from the river bend near the dam to the steep ridges beyond Devil's Hollow, and they hadn't found a single piece of physical evidence to support her claim. There was no dugout beneath a tree, no remnants of rope or fire pits, no footprints, no discarded tools. Nothing that suggested another person had lived or moved through that part of the woods. To the rangers, that silence said more than any confession could. Detective Marla Jensen was the first to voice it out loud during the debrief. "We were chasing a ghost," she said flatly, pushing the stack of reports away from her. "Her story doesn't add up. Either she's lying or she's protecting someone." Her partner, Grant, frowned. "Protecting who?" "The guy she says attacked them." Jensen shook her head. "No, someone she knows. You don't make up the kind of detail about being trapped unless you trying to hide something worse." Avery, standing near the window, kept his thoughts to himself. The word worse echoed through his mind. He'd seen guilt before, seen how people built lies like barricades to keep from collapsing. Emma's fear, her attachment to that hoodie, none of it felt like trauma from a stranger. It felt personal. The sheriff, however, wasn't ready to abandon the abduction theory. The media had turned the case into a spectacle, and publicly reversing course would make the department look incompetent. So the search for the forest man continued, even as evidence against his existence piled up. Teams of officers roamed the ridges with rifles and drones, retracing their steps, sometimes passing their own footprints from the previous week. Locals began to complain about the noise, helicopters thudding overhead, searchlights cutting through their windows at night. Blue Ridge had become a stage set for a ghost story that no longer believed in itself. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Emma's behavior grew stranger. She refused to sleep with the lights off, insisting that he could find her in the dark. Nurses reported that she'd taken to lining up cups of water along the windowsill, whispering something to them before bed. When asked why, she said, "So he can't hear me think." Her psychologist, Dr. Hardy, documented every word. "Patient exhibits symptoms consistent with dissociative trauma," the notes read. However, the absence of physical signs of restraint or malnutrition raises questions about the validity of the described captivity. In other words, she might not be lying outright, but she was almost certainly not telling the truth either. Avery visited again on the 5th day. He found her staring at the rain streaking down the glass, her reflection ghostly against the window. "The forest's quiet today," she said without turning around. "It listens better when it rains." He didn't respond. Instead, he asked if she remembered where she'd been kept, the direction, landmarks, anything. She hesitated, then said softly it wasn't far from the river. You could hear it at night, but it wasn't always there. He frowned. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes," she whispered. He moved it. That made no sense, and Avery didn't press her. He just watched her fingers trace invisible lines on the blanket, like she was drawing a map only she could see. When he left the room, Hardy caught up to him in the hall. "She's deteriorating," the doctor said. "Every time she's questioned, the story changes slightly. That's not memory loss, it's fabrication under stress." Avery nodded slowly. "So you think she's lying?" Hardy paused. "I think she's scared of something, maybe what she did, maybe what she remembers. Either way, she's building a wall out of words." The following morning, a new piece of evidence arrived from the lab: soil samples taken from the cuffs of the hoodie Emma had refused to part with. The analysis showed high concentrations of bituminous shale and limestone fragments, a mix found only in one specific region of the park, the narrow gorge east of Hollow Creek. It was a place the search teams hadn't checked thoroughly because of the unstable terrain. When Jensen read the report, her pulse quickened. "This could be it," she said. "Maybe the dugout's there." Avery wasn't convinced, but he agreed to join the expedition. They set out at dawn, a 4-person team trudging through fog and slick mud. The forest was unnervingly quiet, even for Blue Ridge. No birds, no insects, only the occasional drip of water falling from the leaves. The gorge itself was a scar in the earth, its walls slick with moss, its floor cluttered with boulders and fallen logs. They found traces of old fires near the entrance, ashes long cold, but no shelter, no tools, no signs of habitation. About halfway through the gorge, Avery noticed something else: drag marks in the dirt, faint but unmistakable. They followed them a few yards before the trail vanished beneath a rock slide. It could have been animals, he thought. Or it could have been someone trying to move something heavy. That night, the team filed their report: no dugout, no proof of the kidnapper. But the soil sample connection nodded Avery. Someone or something had been there, and Emma's sweatshirt carried the evidence. Yet her story never mentioned the gorge at all. When he returned to the hospital to ask her about it, she looked confused. "I've never been there," she said. "You must be wrong." Her denial was calm, absolute, too absolute. By now, the public's patience was wearing thin. The newspapers that once called Emma a miracle survivor began to turn. Headlines shifted from "Girl Survives the Wild" to "Blue Ridge Mystery Deepens and Emerge in Captive Case." Online, theories exploded. Some said she'd staged the entire disappearance for attention. Others claimed she was protecting a second attacker. A few dark corners of the internet even suggested she'd killed Ryan herself. The police ignored the noise, but not for long, because some of those questions had begun to creep into their own minds. Avery met with the sheriff again that week. "What if she's not lying about being trapped?" he said carefully. "Just about who trapped her." The sheriff leaned back, eyes tired. "You re-saying she did this? I'm saying maybe it wasn't a stranger." The room went quiet. They both knew what that meant. If Emma had been involved in whatever happened to Ryan, the last month of searching, the helicopters, the manhunt, it had all been built on a false foundation. Meanwhile, in her hospital bed, Emma watched the coverage play out on television, every headline, every photo of her face. The light from the screen flickered across her expression, unreadable. When a nurse came in to turn off the TV, Emma spoke softly, almost to herself. "They think I made him up." The nurse paused. "Did you?" Emma smiled faintly. "No, I just gave him my fears face." That night, Hardy noted in her journal that Emma's mental state had shifted. "She's not frightened anymore," the doctor wrote. "She's waiting." What she was waiting for, no one could say. But Avery, lying awake in his small apartment above the ranger station, had the same feeling that something had started moving beneath the surface of the story, something that had been there from the beginning. And when it finally rose to the light, it wouldn't be the ghost of a forest man at all. It would be something far more human and far harder to forgive. 2 weeks after Emma Collins had been found, the investigation began to tilt in a new direction. What had once seemed like an inexplicable mystery was slowly becoming a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit, a story that refused to hold its own shape. The more the detectives examined her version of events, the more they began to suspect that the real story wasn't about a kidnapper at all, it was about her. The shift started quietly, with a discovery that should have been small: a receipt. It was found by a detective named Ray Carter, a patient man who had spent most of his career chasing paper trails. He'd been reviewing the distribution records of local stores near Blue Ridge, checking for purchases that matched the food wrappers recovered near where Emma was found. One of those wrappers, a rare brand of protein bar, was sold in only a handful of stores within 50 miles. When he called the store owner in the nearby town of Waynesboro, the man remembered something odd. "A girl came in late morning, maybe a week or 2 ago," he said. "She looked young, kind of dirty, bought some bars, a bottle of water, paid cash. Didn't talk much." Carter's heart picked up speed. He asked for the security footage, even though the store owner warned him the cameras were old and the images grainy. The footage was time-stamped May 28, 18 days after Emma had supposedly disappeared. The black and white video showed the front door opening. A girl entered wearing a hood pulled low, her movements cautious but steady. When she looked up briefly, the camera caught her face. It was unmistakable. Emma Collins, alone, alive, no sign of restraint, no sign of anyone following her. The detective called Jensen immediately. Within hours, the video was in evidence custody, and by the next morning, the small conference room at the sheriff's office was packed. The footage was silent, but no one needed sound to feel its weight. Emma moved calmly through the store, selecting a few items, scanning the shelves like someone used to shopping, not someone escaping captivity. She placed the food on the counter, handed over a few bills, waited for her change, and left. The moment she stepped outside, she turned briefly toward the parking lot, glancing back at the camera as if she knew it was there. The silence that followed the viewing was thick, heavy. Jensen broke it first. So much for the forest man. No one disagreed. The implications were staggering. Not only had Emma fabricated her kidnapping, but she'd had multiple opportunities to seek help and had chosen not to. She was free, Carter said quietly. Whatever happened to Ryan, it didn't stop her from walking out of those woods. Avery sat in the corner, staring at the frozen image of Emma's face on the monitor. Her eyes in the video were calm, almost detached. He'd seen that same look in the hospital, that strange stillness that made it impossible to tell what she was thinking. She knew what she was doing, he murmured. She wasn't lost. She was hiding. The sheriff ordered the video to be withheld from the press until they could confront her directly. The next morning, Avery and Jensen drove to the hospital. The air in the room felt charged when they entered. Emma sat in bed with the hoodie folded neatly beside her, as always. When Jensen placed a laptop on the rolling table and pressed play, Emma didn't move at first. Her face remained blank as her image appeared on the screen, walking through the convenience store like a stranger. But as soon as she saw herself hand money to the cashier, a flicker crossed her expression, something sharp and fleeting, like recognition mixed with fear. When the video ended, Jensen folded her hands. "You want to explain this?" she asked. For a long moment, Emma said nothing. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. "That's not me," she said finally. "It can't be." Avery leaned forward. "It's you, Emma. We confirmed it. Same hoodie, same backpack, same scar on your hand. The footage is dated May 28th. You weren't in a hole under a tree. You were walking into a store, buying food, and going back into the woods. Why?" Her silence stretched until Hardy, who had been observing, intervened. "Emma, they're not angry. They just want to understand." Emma's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "I couldn't go home, not after what happened." Jensen's tone softened. "What did happen?" Emma's eyes darted to the hoodie, then back to the detectives. "He fell," she said. "But it wasn't my fault." It was the first real crack in her story, the first time she'd mentioned Ryan's fall. Avery exchanged a glance with Jensen. "Where did he fall, Emma?" he asked gently. "Can you show us?" She shook her head. "I don't know. I ran. I just kept running." Her breathing quickened, her hands gripping the fabric like a lifeline. Hardy signaled for a break, but Emma went on, voice trembling. "He hit his head. There was so much blood. I tried to stop it. I really did. But he stopped breathing, and I didn't know what to do." That confession changed everything. There was no longer any reason to chase an imaginary kidnapper. The investigation turned sharply inward. The video, once evidence of a lie, now became a timeline. Between May 12th, the day of their disappearance, and May 28th, Emma had been alive, mobile, and in control. That left 16 days unaccounted for. 16 days where Ryan Porter's whereabouts were unknown. The detectives retraced every step. They revisited the trail where the scent had vanished, the cliffs above the dam, and finally the gorge identified by the soil samples. Forensics confirmed that the same mineral composition found on Emma's sweatshirt matched that exact location. That meant she had been there, and likely so had Ryan. Back in the lab, the forensic team ran a full DNA test on the bloodstains covering the hoodie. The results were conclusive. The blood belonged to Ryan Porter. But what chilled the investigators was the secondary finding. The sweat and skin cells belonging to Emma were layered on top of the dried blood, meaning she'd worn the hoodie for an extended period after Ryan's blood had dried. The pattern of absorption indicated weeks, not hours. When Avery read the report, his throat tightened. The picture forming in his mind wasn't of a kidnapping or a supernatural disappearance. It was of two teenagers, a fight, a fall, and one terrible mistake that had spiraled into a month-long lie. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence left no room for denial. Emma hadn't been a prisoner. She had been running from guilt, from fear, from the image of a boy she couldn't bring herself to face again. So that night, Jensen drafted a new report titled Reclassification False Abduction Allegation Pending Homicide Review. It was a bureaucratic phrase for something heartbreakingly simple. The monster in the woods wasn't real. The danger had never been a stranger hiding in the trees. It had been panic, teenage emotion, and a split-second decision that couldn't be undone. Outside, the Blue Ridge forest was quiet again, the mist curling through the branches like smoke. For the first time in weeks, the rangers didn't patrol its trails. There was no one left to look for. But Avery couldn't shake the sound of Emma's voice from his mind, soft, fragile, almost pleading. He fell, but it wasn't my fault. He knew those words would echo long after the case was closed, because in that quiet mountain silence, truth never really vanished. It just waited, buried beneath fear, until someone was brave or broken enough to dig it up. The jacket had always been there, quietly haunting the corner of every photograph, folded neatly beside her in every interview. The one constant in Emma Cullins's story. It was the only thing she refused to part with, the single thread connecting her to the world before the forest swallowed her life whole. So now that same piece of fabric was what began to unravel everything she'd built. When the forensics lab sent back the final report, the language was clinical, detached, but the meaning struck like thunder. The blood belongs to Ryan Porter. The secondary layering confirms extended contact after the blood had dried. In simpler terms, Emma hadn't been wearing Ryan's hoodie when he bled on it. She'd been wearing it afterward long enough for her own sweat and skin cells to saturate the fibers above his. Detective Jensen stared at the printed report under the sterile lights of the evidence room, her jaw clenched. "This isn't a kidnapping," she said finally. "It's a cover-up." Avery stood across from her, silent. He'd known the moment he saw the preliminary data, but hearing it said aloud carried a weight he wasn't ready to bear. The lab soil analysis had already placed the jacket in a specific location, Hollow Creek Gorge, a narrow, treacherous ravine 2 miles from where Emma was eventually found. Now, with the blood results confirming Ryan's death, that gorge had become the center of the investigation. The following morning, a search team was dispatched to Hollow Creek, this time with crime scene specialists rather than rangers. The path was steep, overgrown with moss and ferns, and the air smelled faintly metallic, like old rain and rust. Avery led the team down, the sound of their boots muffled by the damp earth. The gorge itself was narrow enough that sunlight barely touched the ground. Water trickled through the rocks, carrying the faint murmur of the mountain's heartbeats. About halfway down, they reached a cluster of boulders streaked with reddish stains. One of the technicians called out, voice tight, "We've got something." Beneath a shelf of rock and leaves lay the remnants of what had once been a campfire, small, hastily made, surrounded by broken sticks and flattened moss. Near it, half buried under stones, was the unmistakable shape of a human arm. Time and weather had done their work, but the blue wristband, faded and frayed, matched the one Ryan Porter's mother had described in her missing person report. The discovery froze everyone in place. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind brushing through the gorge. Avery stepped forward, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. When the light hit the pale curve of a skull, the truth became undeniable. The coroner's report later confirmed the details blunt. Force trauma to the skull consistent with a fall onto jagged rock, no defensive wounds, no signs of prolonged struggle. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. The medical examiner noted fractures consistent with a drop of 30 to 40 feet, which matched the cliff edge near the trail where Emma and Ryan had last been seen. Everything, the soil, the jacket, the wounds, pointed to a single moment of violence, accidental or otherwise. When the news reached the hospital, Emma didn't cry. Hardy was with her when the detectives arrived to deliver the confirmation. She sat motionless, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the hoodie beside her like a relic. Jensen laid the folder on the table and spoke gently. "Emma, we found Ryan. He didn't suffer." For a heartbeat, Emma's expression didn't change. Then her shoulders sagged and she whispered, "I know." Hardy glanced sharply at her. "You know." Emma nodded, eyes distant. "He was gone before I came back." The room went still. Jensen leaned forward. "Came back from where?" Emma's gaze lifted, unfocused, as if she were staring through them. "From getting help," she said, "but I couldn't find anyone. When I got back, he wasn't breathing, so I stayed." Avery could hear the tremor in her voice, the guilt, the exhaustion. He'd seen that kind of quiet surrender before, but who in people had carried a secret too long. "Emma," he said softly, "we think you tried to save him. We know it was an accident." Her head snapped toward him, eyes wide. "It wasn't," she said, her voice cracking. "I pushed him." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. She broke then not into sobs, but into a slow, trembling confession that poured out like a river breaking through a dam. She told them about the argument, how it had started as something small, something stupid. Ryan had teased her about being cautious, about always needing control. She'd accused him of flirting with another girl on social media. They were standing near the edge of the ridge, both shouting over the wind. "He laughed," she said, "and I don't know. I wanted him to stop laughing. I shoved him." She demonstrated the motion with her hands, small and desperate. "He slipped. The ground was wet. It happened so fast." After the fall, she scrambled down the rocks, screaming his name. She found him lying against a boulder, blood pooling beneath his head. She tried to wake him, shook him until she realized he wasn't moving. "I thought if I could keep him warm, maybe he'd wake up," she said. "I took his jacket and covered him, but it didn't help." Her voice faltered. "I didn't know what to do. I thought they'd think I killed him on purpose, so I hid him. I covered the rocks. I put stones over his face because I couldn't look anymore." Jensen closed her notebook slowly. The silence in the room was suffocating. Hardy placed a hand on Emma's shoulder, but she flinched away. "I didn't mean to lie," Emma whispered. "I just couldn't stop seeing it when I closed my eyes, so I made him into someone else. The man in the woods. If I said he was real, maybe he'd take the blame." That night, Avery drove up the mountain one last time, following the path to the gorge. The search crews had already cleared out, leaving behind only the faint smell of disturbed earth and rain. He stood at the edge of the ridge, where the ground sloped sharply downward, the same place Emma had described. The drop wasn't far, but it was enough. He imagined the argument, the push, the single moment that had shattered two lives. The forest below was quiet, indifferent. It had seen worse, and it would again. When he returned to the station, the sheriff was waiting with the official paperwork. Emma Collins was being charged with involuntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice. Because she was 17, she'd be tried as a minor. The press wouldn't be allowed in the courtroom. "It's the best we can do," the sheriff said. "She didn't mean to kill him." Avery nodded, though the words didn't make it any lighter. In the weeks that followed, Blue Ridge returned to its stillness. The search signs came down, the news crews packed up, and the forest grew thick with summer again. But those who'd been part of the case couldn't forget the image of the girl sitting under the fallen oak, clutching that blood-stained hoodie as if it were armor. They knew that what kept her alive in those woods wasn't luck or divine mercy. It was guilt, raw, unrelenting guilt that drove her deeper into the forest until she became part of its silence. Avery often thought of her words during the confession. "If I said he was real, maybe he'd take the blame." In some strange way, she had been right. For weeks, the entire country had believed in a monster that never existed, and for a while, that belief had protected her from herself. The forest man had taken the blame, and the truth had slept under the stones until the mountain was ready to give it back. Now, standing on his porch with the cicadas humming in the dusk, Avery looked toward the dark line of trees in the distance. He wondered how many other stories the forest still held, how many truths were buried beneath fear and time. The Blue Ridge, he thought, didn't devour people. It simply waited for them to face what they'd buried, and sometimes that was the same thing as never coming back. The interview room was dimly lit, its walls bare except for the soft hum of a ceiling vent and the faint buzz of the fluorescent light above. Emma Collins sat at the metal table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, wrists still trembling from the shock of confession. Across from her sat Detective Jensen and Ranger Tom Avery, both silent for a long moment, letting the weight of her words hang heavy between them. On the table lay a digital recorder, its red light blinking patiently, capturing every breath. Outside the glass, the sheriff and Drew. Gwen Hardy observed through the two-way mirror, faces unreadable. Emma had already told them how Ryan had fallen, how she'd tried to save him, how panic had turned her into someone she didn't recognize. But now, under the harsh light of the truth, the smallest inconsistencies began to bloom like bruises. "You said he slipped," Jensen began softly. But the coroner found an impression of fingers on his arm, 4 distinct marks, like someone grabbed him just before he went over. Emma's eyes flickered upward, the barest hint of defiance flashing in their pale green depths. I tried to pull him back, she said, her voice steady but thin. He was falling. She stopped. Her lips trembled. I couldn't hold on. Avery watched her closely, not because he doubted her, but because he wanted to understand the moment that had changed everything. He'd seen hundreds of accidents in the mountains, people slipping, falling, vanishing into the woods, but this wasn't that. This was something uglier, more human. You stayed near his body for a while, didn't you? He asked quietly. Emma hesitated, then nodded. I didn't know where to go. I thought if I stayed, someone would find us, but no one came. It rained that night. I tried to keep him covered. Her voice cracked on the last word. I used his jacket because he was cold. The confession, though halting, flowed from her in bursts, small, scattered pieces of memory that painted the shape of guilt. She spoke about wandering through the forest for days afterward, too afraid to come out, convinced every sound was someone coming for her. When she finally stumbled across a road, she almost turned back. I couldn't go home, she whispered. I couldn't tell anyone what I'd done. So she'd gone into Waynesboro instead, buying food and water from that small store. When asked why she didn't ask for help then, she looked down. Because if I said it out loud, it would be real. Jensen leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Emma, when you told us about the man in the woods, the one who took you, why did you make him up? Emma's gaze dropped to her hands. He was easier than me, she said after a moment. Everyone believes in monsters. No one believes a good person can do something terrible. Hardy, watching from behind the glass, scribbled that line into her notebook. She would later call it the most honest thing the girl ever said. The recording went on for hours. Emma didn't cry, didn't beg for sympathy. Her voice was soft, detached, as though she were describing someone else's tragedy. When Jensen finally turned off the recorder, the silence that followed was suffocating. Avery rose from his chair, pacing slowly around the room. Emma, he said gently, when you covered Ryan's body, when you left him there, did you ever think about going back? Her answer came without hesitation. Every day I heard him in the trees. Sometimes I thought he was talking to me. She smiled faintly, an eerie expression that sent a chill down his spine. That's why I stayed in the woods. I wasn't running from him. I was waiting for him to forgive me. Outside, Hardy pressed her hand against the glass, shaken. She's not delusional, she whispered. She's grieving herself. The sheriff said nothing. He'd seen too many cases where remorse twisted people into shapes that reason couldn't reach. Get the paperwork ready, he said. She'll be charged in the morning. Later that night, after the questioning ended, Avery walked Emma down the narrow hall toward the holding area. The station was nearly empty, the lights dimmed, the sound of cicadas leaking through the open window at the end of the corridor. Emma moved quietly beside him, her hands cuffed loosely in front of her. She didn't ask where they were going, didn't speak at all until they reached the door. Is it dark out there? She asked suddenly. Avery blinked. Out where? In the forest, she said. I used to be scared of the dark. Not anymore. It feels fair now. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. The next morning, the sheriff's office released a short statement to the press confirming that Emma Collins had confessed to Ryan Porter's death. The announcement hit the town like a shockwave. The same reporters who'd once called her the Blue Ridge Miracle now labeled her the girl who lied. Online forums filled with speculation and vitriol. Some called her a sociopath, others a broken child. Her mother, Laura Collins, stopped leaving the house altogether. Ryan's parents issued their own statement, asking for privacy, but it was clear from their words that forgiveness would never come. Our son deserved truth, his father said. She gave him silence instead. As the case moved toward trial, the public's fascination with the story only grew darker. News networks replayed clips of Emma's first hospital appearance, the haunted eyes, the blood-stained jacket, and dissected every expression like an artifact. But inside the courthouse, the mood was subdued, almost reverent. Emma sat at the defense table in a plain gray sweater, her hair tied back, her face expressionless. Her lawyer argued for leniency, citing her age, her trauma, her complete cooperation after the confession. The prosecution countered with the facts. She had lied, obstructed an investigation, and let families and officers risk their lives searching for a man who never existed. When she took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke softly, clearly owning every word. I didn't mean for him to die, she said. We were angry. I pushed him. It was 1 second, just one, and then everything stopped. She paused, her eyes flicking toward the judge. I thought if I told the truth, no one would ever look at me again, so I made up a story. I thought if the woods had taken him, maybe I could still be good. The judge's verdict came down heavy but not cruel. Emma was sentenced to a juvenile facility for manslaughter and obstruction with the possibility of release at 21. When the gavel fell, she didn't cry. She simply nodded, as though she'd been waiting for that sound since the moment she'd left Ryan beneath the rocks. After the sentencing, Avery drove up to Blue Ridge alone. The forest was quieter than he remembered, the air thick with summer heat. He parked near the old trailhead where the story had begun and walked until the sound of the road faded behind him. At the overlook, he stopped. From there he could see the whole valley, the endless sweep of green, the slow curl of fog rising from the gorge. Somewhere down there, under the trees, was the place where a boy had fallen and a girl had broken apart. He crouched beside the rocks, running his fingers over the dirt. The forest smelled alive again, wet, clean, almost forgiving. And for the first time, Avery understood what Emma had meant when she said she heard Ryan in the trees. It wasn't madness. It was the weight of what she couldn't undo, echoing through the landscape, turning silence into memory. When he finally turned to leave, the sun was setting, painting the ridge in gold and blood-red light. He looked back one last time, the wind whispering through the leaves. Somewhere far away a bird called, and for a brief second it sounded almost human, a cry and an answer carried by the mountains. Avery didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in guilt, and in the strange way the earth sometimes holds onto the stories people try to bury. Emma Collins' story would fade from headlines, eventually replaced by newer tragedies. But for those who'd walked those trails, who'd searched those woods, the memory lingered. Because Blue Ridge had taught them something terrible and true, that monsters aren't born in the dark corners of the forest. They were born in moments of weakness, in the split second when love turns to fear and someone forgets where the edge is. And once that line is crossed, the forest doesn't have to take you. You stay there on your own. The confession might have closed the case, but it didn't close the story. The police reports, the autopsy, the courtroom testimony, all of it created a version of what happened that was clean, linear, and easy to file away. But the truth was messier than paper could hold. It existed in the small, unbearable details that Emma Collins could never quite forget: the way Ryan had turned to her before he fell, half smiling even as they argued, the smell of rain on stone, or the hollow thud of his body hitting the rocks below. Those things didn't live in the record. They lived in her dreams, replaying again and again, as if the mountains refused to let her rest. After her sentencing, Emma was transferred to a juvenile rehabilitation center outside Asheville. The place wasn't a prison, at least not in the traditional sense. It was quiet, sterile, full of gray walls and patient voices. Counselors called her sweetheart, other girls called her the ghost, and the guards never raised their voices. Most of the inmates were there for theft, drugs, the usual teenage rebellions that spun too far out of control. None of them knew what to make of the girl who'd survived the forest only to admit she'd put someone in the ground. She rarely spoke. When she did, it was short and soft, like she was afraid her words might wake something up. Her therapist, Diderot, was a calm man in his 50s who believed in routine. Every morning he met her in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, a notebook balanced on his knee. For weeks, their sessions followed the same rhythm. He'd ask her what she remembered, and she'd answer in fragments, each sentence peeling back another layer of the forest she still carried inside her. "It's not just the sound," she told him once. "It's the way the quiet presses against you, like it knows something you don't." Roe would nod, writing in his looping script. When he asked about Ryan, she'd close her eyes. "I see his hands," she whispered. "They were always reaching, not for me, for the edge." Outside, the world moved on. The news cycle devoured newer scandals, fresher horrors. Blue Ridge reopened to the public by late fall, though few locals returned to the Cascade Trail. The path was still slick with moss and ruma, the air still carrying that faint metallic tang that people swore was blood even when the rangers told them it was iron in the soil. Hikers left flowers by the overlook where Ryan had fallen, a quiet memorial that the wind scattered every few days. In town, his name faded from headline but had stayed alive in whispers. Some said Emma had been jealous. Others said Ryan had pushed her first. Truth, as always, belonged to the people who could no longer defend themselves. Avery visited the gorge one last time before winter. He'd told himself it was to ensure the area was safe for hikers again. But deep down he knew it was to see the place with his own eyes, to stand where everything had gone wrong. The rocks were slick with frost, the air thin enough to sting his lungs. He crouched near the spot where they'd found Ryan's body, brushing his gloved hand against the cold stone. He imagined the two of them there, young and angry and terrified, arguing about something so small that it now seemed laughable. He thought of how easily it had all happened, one step too close, one push, 1 second. That was all it took. When he returned to his truck, the sky had gone gray. From the ridge above, the forest stretched endlessly vast and indifferent. He knew it was pointless to assign meaning to it. But he couldn't help thinking that the mountain didn't judge, it simply mirrored what people brought to it. Fear, guilt, love, violence, all of it echoed back in the stillness. Blue Ridge had become, in his mind, a place that absorbed confession like soil absorbs rain. Back at the rehabilitation center, Emma's days blended together: breakfast, therapy, reading, silence. She was allowed outside for 1 hour each afternoon, and she always spent it standing at the edge of the yard, staring through the wire fence toward the distant tree line. The mountains were faint there, just a smudge of blue against the horizon, but she watched them like they might someday answer her. Sometimes in that hour she talked quietly to herself. The guards assumed she was praying, but she wasn't. She was speaking to Ryan, or to the version of him she'd made up to survive. "You would be hated this place," she said once. "Too many rules. You liked open spaces." Judereau noted her fixation in his reports. "Patient continues to externalize guilt through imagined dialogue with the deceased," he wrote. "Displays increasing detachment from self-blame, but persistent fear of forgetting the event. Believes forgetting equals erasure of him." In one session he asked her directly, "Do you think you've forgiven yourself?" She smiled faintly, a hollow curve of lips that didn't reach her eyes. "Forgiveness isn't for people who push others off cliffs," she said. "It's for the ones who stop looking down." Months passed. Seasons changed. The snow came and melted, and by spring the forest bloomed again, hiding every scar under green. The Park Service erected a small plaque near the overlook in memory of Ryan Porter, who loved these mountains. People left notes there, sometimes folded scraps of paper pressed under rocks. One of them simply read, "She didn't mean it." No one ever claimed to have written it. Avery never visited Emma again, though he thought about it often. He'd tell himself that she was safer where she was, that reopening those wounds would help no one. But some nights, when the wind carried the smell of pine and rain through his window, he would remember the way she'd said the woods were listening. It didn't sound like madness to him anymore. It sounded like truth, the kind people avoided because it was too heavy to carry. In the second year of her confinement, Emma began to write, not letters, not a diary, stories. Rowe encouraged it, saying it could help her process the trauma. But her stories weren't about the forest or Ryan. They were about ghosts who couldn't find their names, about girls who mistook silence for forgiveness, about rivers that swallowed secrets whole. She never showed anyone the pages, keeping them hidden under her mattress. "If I write it down," she said, "it stays real." When she turned 18, she was allowed limited internet access for educational purposes. One afternoon, she searched for news of Blue Ridge. What she found startled her: a brief article about a new hiking trail being opened near Hollow Creek Gorge, built to replace the one closed after her case. The image showed a family smiling beneath the same cliffs, the same trees, sunlight pouring through the branches as if the forest had never seen tragedy. Emma stared at the photo until her vision blurred. For a moment she hated the world for moving on so easily. Then quietly, she closed the browser. That night she dreamed of the mountain. In the dream she was back on the ridge, but Ryan wasn't there. The air was still, the sky endless. She looked down at her hands, expecting to see blood, but they were clean. When she turned toward the trees, she heard a voice, not his, but her own, whispering from somewhere deep in the forest, "You can go now." She woke with tears on her cheeks. A few months later, Judereau noted that she'd begun to smile more often. Not joy, he wrote, but acceptance. She spoke less about the woods, less about Ryan, and more about what she wanted when she got out. "I think I'll go somewhere flat," she said during their last session before summer. "Somewhere I can see everything coming." He nodded. "That sounds good." On his drive home, he passed the Blue Ridge line and saw the mountains glowing in the sunset. For a moment, he thought he saw two figures standing near the overlook, a girl in a dark jacket and a boy beside her, his arm draped gently over her shoulders. But when he blinked, they were gone. Time would continue to move, carrying the story of Emma Collins and Ryan Porter deeper into the folds of the past. The town would forget, the forest would grow, and the people who once searched those woods would stop returning. But the mountain would remember. It always did, because guilt, like the forest, doesn't die, it only waits for silence long enough to bloom again. 3 years passed before anyone in Blue Ridge spoke Emma Collins's name aloud again. The story that had once dominated every television network and newsfeed had faded into rumor, a cautionary tale told to teenagers about anger, consequence, and the thin line between accident and intent. By then, Emma had become a ghost not just to the world but to herself. At 20 years old, she had grown quieter, thinner, and almost translucent in the way people do when they spend too much time thinking about what they can't undo. Her hair was shorter now, her voice lower, her hands always cold. Most of the girls at the juvenile facility had come and gone, serving their sentences for the small crimes of youth. But Emma remained, serving time not just for the court, but for the mountain. Drew Barreau still met with her twice a week. Their conversations had shifted over time, no longer about Ryan's death or the forest, but about the quiet that followed it. "Do you still dream about Blue Ridge?" he asked one morning, his pen tapping against his notes. She shook her head, then hesitated. "It's not the place," she said softly, the feeling. He waited. "It's like when fog moves through the trees, and you can't see what's ahead, but you keep walking anyway because stopping feels worse." Rose smiled faintly. "You re-describing life?" She looked at him, then, eyes steady. "No, I'm describing guilt." When she turned 21, her parole hearing arrived. The counselors testified to her progress, her cooperation, her calm demeanor. The court reviewed her file, her therapy reports, the letters of recommendation written by staff who'd watched her grow into something resembling peace. Even Ryan's parents were there, sitting stiffly in the back row. They didn't speak, but their presence said enough. After a short deliberation, the board granted Emma's release. "She has served her sentence," the judge said. "What comes next is hers to decide." The morning she left the facility, she didn't look back. A social worker drove her into town, where she would stay temporarily in a halfway house until she could find work. The town was smaller than she remembered, quieter, emptier. People still recognized her, though. The woman at the diner looked up as she walked in, froze, then pretended not to see her. Whispers followed her through the grocery store. Children stared until their parents turned them away. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was fear, the kind people feel when they see living proof of how thin the line is between being young and making a mistake that ruins everything. At night, Emma sat by the window of her small room, staring at the mountains in the distance. They looked softer from here, washed in blue and gold, but she knew how deceptive that calm could be. She often wondered if Ryan's body was still down there somewhere, beneath the moss and the earth, or if the forest had taken him completely. "You forgive everything eventually," she murmured once to the darkness, "even yourself." But the words didn't sound convincing. A few months after her release, Avery came to find her. He was older now, his hair gone grayer, his uniform replaced by a ranger's flannel and a weathered badge. He found her working at a small bookstore near the edge of town, shelving paperbacks with quiet precision. When he said her name, she froze for a moment, then turned slowly. "I thought you'd forgotten about me," she said, her tone flat but not unkind. "No," he replied, "some stories don't let go that easy." They went for coffee at a diner off the highway, the same one where he used to meet the search teams years ago. The walls were still lined with photographs of hikers and waterfalls, the same smell of old coffee grounds clinging to the air. For a long time they didn't talk. Finally Avery spoke. "The park reopened the old trail," he said. "Families hike it again. You can see the ridge from a new platform they built." Emma stared at her cup. "Does it feel different?" "It feels the same," he admitted. "But maybe that's the point." She looked up at him then, her expression unreadable. "Do you think people can come back from what they've done?" He considered his answer carefully. "I think people can learn to carry it better. That's not the same as forgiveness, but it's close." She nodded, as if filing that away somewhere deep inside. "I still hear him sometimes," she said after a pause. "Not his voice, exactly. Just a sound, like footsteps on wet leaves." Avery's hands tightened around his coffee mug. "Maybe it's memory," he offered. "Maybe it's the forest reminding you that it's still there." She smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the same thing." After that, they met a few more times, short conversations in the same diner, small talk about the weather, the mountains, The things people say when they read too afraid to talk about what really matters. Then one day, she stopped showing up. The manager at the bookstore said she'd quit suddenly, leaving behind a note that simply read, "Thank you for letting me disappear quietly." 2 weeks later, a ranger found a familiar pair of footprints near the ridge. The tracks led off the main trail into the deeper part of the forest where moss covered everything and the air hung heavy with silence. They followed them for nearly a mile before they stopped abruptly at the edge of a clearing. No sign of struggle, no indication she'd gone any further. Just the prints, and beside them, a single folded page weighted down by a stone. It was torn from a notebook, the writing neat and careful. "He forgave me first," it said. "Now it's my turn." The search was quiet, almost perfunctory. They knew she didn't want to be found. There was no sign of a fall, no body, no trace of clothing. It was as if the forest had opened its arms and taken her gently this time. The newspapers barely covered it, just a small paragraph buried on page 5. Emma Collins, 21, presumed missing near Blue Ridge National Park. Authorities suspect self-harm, though search efforts continue. Avery went up to the ridge alone that evening. He stood at the overlook as the sun sank behind the peaks, painting the trees in gold and shadow. The air was heavy with the smell of rain. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled softly. He looked down at the valley, at the spot where it had all begun, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw movement among the trees, a figure, small and still, standing just beyond the light. He blinked, and it was gone. He stayed there until the stars came out, the forest alive with the low hum of night creatures. As he turned to leave, he whispered something into the wind, not sure if it was prayer or goodbye. "I hope you finally found the quiet you were looking for." The wind rustled through the trees like a sigh. In the years that followed, hikers continued to vanish now and then, as they always had. Most were found alive, disoriented, claiming they'd wandered off the trail and lost their bearings. But a few spoke of strange things, voices calling from the mist, the sound of a girl humming somewhere in the trees, and sometimes the faint smell of rain when the sky was clear. The rangers learned not to ask too many questions. Avery eventually retired, but he kept a small map of Blue Ridge pinned to the wall of his cabin. On quiet nights, he traced the path of Cascade Trail with his finger, stopping at the spot where the forest had taken both of them. He didn't know whether to call it a tragedy or a mercy. All he knew was that the mountain had a way of keeping what it was owed, and sometimes that included peace. And so the story of Emma Collins and Ryan Porter faded into the landscape of Blue Ridge, whispered by wind and remembered by trees. The forest had given back a girl once, just long enough for her to tell the truth. Then, when the time came, it took her again, not out of cruelty but out of recognition, because in the end, Blue Ridge never punished. It only waited. It was late autumn when the first news story began to circle through the Blue Ridge towns, one that sounded eerily familiar. A pair of hikers from Atlanta had gone missing after venturing off trail near Hollow Creek Gorge. They were experienced, equipped with GPS trackers, radios, and satellite phones, yet all contact stopped just before sunset. The next morning, rescue teams found their gear scattered along the edge of the ridge, as though it had been dropped mid-step. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, only a faint path of disturbed leaves that ended abruptly at the treeline. To anyone who had lived through the Emma Collins case, the pattern felt too precise to be coincidence. Tom Avery, now retired, learned about it the same way everyone else did, from the local news playing softly in the corner of his kitchen. The anchor's voice was calm, detached, describing the search effort in broad stroke as two hikers, both in their 30s, last seen near the overlook. Weather conditions stable. But the footage of the forest behind her made Avery's chest tighten. The mist rolling over the ridge, the skeletal trees against a dull gray sky, it looked exactly as it had years ago, the day Emma was found. He turned off the television, but the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was the same heavy quiet he remembered from before, the kind that made the walls feel too thin. By noon, his phone began to ring. The first call came from a former ranger, the second from a journalist who still covered the region. Both wanted the same thing, his thoughts. He told them what he told everyone: he didn't speculate, didn't chase ghosts anymore. But when night came and he couldn't sleep, he found himself driving up the old mountain road, the one he'd promised never to take again. The trees closed around him, their branches bending under the weight of fog. It was as if the forest had been waiting for him to come back. The search camp was smaller than the one he remembered, but the atmosphere was the same, a blend of exhaustion and denial. Volunteers moved like shadows between the tents, their flashlights flickering through the mist. A young ranger recognized him immediately. "You Avery, right? From the Collins case," he nodded. The ranger hesitated, then said quietly, "You should see this." They led him to a section of the gorge roped off with yellow tape. In the mud, faint but visible, were two sets of footprints heading toward the river and a third set crossing theirs at an angle. The third was smaller, lighter, and stopped halfway, as if whoever made them had simply turned back. The ranger crouched beside the tracks, pointing to the faint outline near the toe. "See that? Looks like it's been stepped over rain, but it's fresh, couldn't be older than 2 days. Avery felt the hair on his arms rise. "You think it's a rescue worker?" he asked. The ranger shook his head. "No one's been this far out yet." That night, the wind picked up, rattling the trees until the forest seemed alive. Avery sat by the campfire, staring into the flames, trying to convince himself that what he'd seen was nothing more than coincidence. But the memory of Emma's final note, "He forgave me first, now it's my turn," wouldn't leave him. He remembered how the searchers never found her body, how the forest had gone silent for months afterward, almost as if it had taken a deep breath. Now, with 2 more people missing, it felt like the mountain was exhaling again. At dawn, he joined a small search team climbing the eastern ridge. The ground was slick, the air heavy with the smell of rain. The trail wound higher until it opened into a clearing overlooking the valley. From there, the forest stretched endlessly, vast and indifferent. One of the younger rangers stopped suddenly, pointing toward a cluster of rocks. "There's something white." They approached slowly. It was a scrap of fabric, torn and muddy, caught on a branch. Avery lifted it carefully. It was part of a jacket sleeve. And not just any jacket, he recognized the stitching, the faded brand logo. It was the same model Emma Collins had worn the day she was found. He didn't say anything. Instead, he folded the cloth and slipped it into his pocket. The other rangers kept searching, calling out names that vanished into the fog. No one found anything else that day. By evening, the weather turned and the search was called off until morning, but Avery didn't leave. He stayed behind after the others returned to camp, walking deeper into the woods as the last light faded. The forest grew darker with every step, the air colder, until all sound seemed to stop. He found himself standing at the edge of Hollow Creek Gorge, staring down into the same abyss that had taken Ryan Porter years before. Something moved below, slow, deliberate. Avery froze. It wasn't an animal. The movement was too smooth, too human. A flicker of pale light glowed briefly, then vanished. He called out, his voice echoing off the stone. "Hello." No answer. Only the whisper of wind through the trees. He told himself it was a trick of the fog, his mind replaying ghosts he'd spent years trying to bury. But as he turned to leave, he heard it again, a soft, rhythmic sound, like footsteps on wet leaves following him at a distance. He didn't look back. By morning, he told no one what he'd seen. The second day of the search ended like the first, no sign of the hikers, no clues beyond the scattered gear. But that night, as the team prepared to leave, one of the volunteers, a woman from Asheville, approached Avery. "You worked on the Collins case, didn't you?" she asked. "My brother was one of the divers back then. He said they used to hear music at night. It's like someone humming." She hesitated. "We heard it last night, too." Avery didn't answer. He didn't have to. He knew better than to explain what couldn't be explained. The forest didn't need witnesses. It needed believers, and for all his skepticism, he couldn't deny that the patterns were too precise, the silences too deliberate. The mountain wasn't cruel, it was patient, it remembered. When he finally left the search camp, he drove down the mountain road without looking in the rearview mirror. But halfway down, he stopped the truck and stepped out, drawn by the faint sound of wind moving through the pines. It almost sounded like a voice, a girl's voice, humming softly, carried on the breeze. He stood there for a long time, the sound rising and falling with the air, until it faded completely. Weeks later, the missing hikers' bodies were found near the river, buried under a shallow layer of soil. Their deaths were ruled accidental. One had slipped, and the other had likely tried to help. The official report made no mention of the footprints, the humming, or the torn sleeve found at the gorge. The case closed quietly, just as Emma's had years before. But for Avery, peace never came. He moved away from Blue Ridge that winter, settling in a small town far to the east. Yet some nights, when the wind blew through the trees outside his window, he could swear he heard that same distant humming. It was never loud, never clear, but always there, an echo from the mountain that refused to die. People said the forest was just a place, that it didn't keep memories. But Avery knew better. He'd seen what guilt could do when left to fester in silence, how it could take root in the soil and wait patient as time itself. Maybe the mountain hadn't taken Emma out of punishment or mercy. Maybe it had taken her because she belonged there now, a part of its endless whispering. And maybe, just maybe, the hikers hadn't been lost at all. They'd simply stepped into a story that never stopped repeating itself. As the years wore on, Blue Ridge remained beautiful, dangerous, and strangely alive. The locals spoke less about Emma and Ryan, but the hikers still left ribbons on the trail, little offerings of color fluttering in the wind. The forest, as always, said nothing. It didn't need to. Its silence was its answer, and its answer was always the same: everything that's lost finds its way back here eventually. Winter came early to Blue Ridge that year. The first frost crept down from the peaks before Thanksgiving, glazing the branches in glass and turning the trails into silver ribbons of ice. Snow fell heavier than usual, muffling the forest in a silence that felt absolute. By then, the hiker's case had faded from public attention, just as Emma Collins's had years before. Only a few locals still spoke of it quietly over coffee in the diner or beside the post office stove. Most had learned not to say her name out loud anymore, as if doing so might wake something best left buried. But for those who had lived through it, the rangers, the families, and especially Tom Avery, the story refused to die. He'd moved far from the mountains by then, settling in a quiet town along the coast. His new home was small and simple, a single-story cottage facing the sea. The constant sound of waves was supposed to soothe him, to drown out the ghosts that Blue Ridge had left behind. But some nights, when the wind shifted and the tide hissed against the rocks, he could swear it sounded like rain on leaves. He still woke sometimes expecting to see the outlines of trees outside his window, the narrow trunks, the thin mist, the dark weight of the forest pressing in. It took him a moment each time to remember that the woods were hundreds of miles away. He'd left the ranger's badge in a drawer, along with the case files he could never bring himself to throw out. Occasionally he opened them, reading over the reports by lamplight: Emma Collins, age 17, Ryan Porter, age 18, death ruled accidental. The papers were yellowed now, the ink faintly smudged from the damp. But even after all those years, one photograph still stopped him cold: the picture of Emma sitting under the fallen oak. Her hands wrapped around the blood-stained hoodie, eyes staring into something far away. She didn't look afraid in that photo. She looked like someone who'd already made peace with what was coming. On a gray December morning, a letter arrived at Avery's mailbox with no return address. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the ink faded as if the note had been written long before it was sent. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice over. "You were right about the forest," it said. "It keeps what it's given. But some of us were never meant to leave." There was no signature, but the writing was familiar, the same looping, precise script from the reports Emma had written in juvenile detention. At the bottom, faint and almost erased by moisture, was a line of numbers that looked like coordinates. He told himself it couldn't be real. She'd been gone for years, disappeared, presumed dead. Maybe it was a cruel prank, or maybe someone had found her old things and decided to play games. But that night, long after he should have let it go, he entered the coordinates into his laptop. The screen flickered and loaded a map. The point was marked deep within the park, just east of Hollow Creek Gorge, near a place known only to the oldest rangers as the Basin, a natural hollow where rainwater pooled and vanished underground through limestone cracks. It wasn't part of any official trail. No one went there anymore. By dawn, Avery was already on the road. The sky was low and heavy with snow, the mountains ahead swallowed in mist. He told himself it was closure. He wanted one last look before the years erased everything. But deep down, he knew it was something else. He needed to see whether the forest still remembered her, or if it had finally let her go. The closer he drove, the more the air seemed to change. The sharp, clean smell of pine returned, and with it the old ache in his chest. He reached the trailhead by mid-afternoon. The park was officially closed for the season, but the gates were never locked for long. Locals always found their way in. He strapped on his boots, slung his pack over his shoulder, and began the climb. The snow made the trail unrecognizable, the trees bowed low under its weight. He walked for hours, guided only by memory and instinct. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. By the time he reached the ridge, even the wind had died. The forest didn't just look still, it looked expectant, like it had been holding its breath. He found the basin just as the last light faded. It was smaller than he imagined, a circular hollow surrounded by frost-bitten trees, the ground slick with ice. At the center was a shallow pool, frozen solid, its surface smooth as glass. Avery stood at the edge, breath fogging in the cold, unsure what he expected to find. Then he saw it, half buried in the snow near the water's edge, a strip of dark fabric. He knelt and brushed the frost away. It was the same material he'd found near the gorge years ago, but this time the cloth was clean, whole, untouched by decay. Folded beneath it was another piece of paper, sealed in plastic. His hands trembled as he opened it. "You don't have to understand," the note read. It wasn't punishment. It was return. "The mountain keeps balance in its own way. Tell them to stop looking, it's quieter that way." He read it twice before realizing what he was holding wasn't a recent letter. It was weathered, edges soft and yellowed, as if it had been there for years. For a long time he didn't move. The trees around him seemed to lean closer, the cold air pressing against his lungs. Somewhere far off a branch cracked, echoing through the gorge. He stood scanning the woods, but saw nothing. And yet the feeling of being watched was undeniable. He wasn't afraid, just aware, as if the forest itself was acknowledging him. Slowly he folded the note, slipped it back beneath the fabric, and left it there. As he turned to leave, something in the snow caught his eye, a single footprint, smaller than his, leading away from the basin toward the trees. He followed it for a few steps before it disappeared into the undergrowth. The forest had already begun erasing its trace. He smiled faintly, almost sadly, then whispered, "All right, Emma, I'll stop looking." He hiked back down in silence, the snow beginning to fall again. When he reached his truck, he looked back one last time. Through the blur of white, he thought he saw a figure at the ridge, a slender shape standing still among the trees, hair pale against the shadows. But when he blinked, the shape dissolved into mist. Avery never told anyone about the letter or the basin. In his official report, one last entry written in the notebook he'd kept for decades, he recorded only a single line: "The mountain is quiet again." Years later, hikers who passed through Hollow Creek, some claimed to find small tokens left along the trail: smooth river stones stacked in careful spirals, ribbons tied to branches, a single bootprint frozen in mud long after the rain had stopped. Some said it was superstition, others said it was the wind. But a few swore they'd heard something else, soft humming in the distance, a tune without words, rising and falling with the breeze. The legend of Blue Ridge became part of local folklore, a story parents told to remind their children that the mountain was not to be underestimated. They said that once a girl had vanished there after telling a lie so big it became truth, and that now she walked the woods in silence, keeping watch over those who lost their way. Some believed she was a ghost, others an angel, but everyone agreed on one thing: the forest never forgot her. For Avery, the mountain remained in his dreams long after he left it behind. Sometimes he woke to the sound of wind and thought he could hear her voice, not calling for help, but saying goodbye. He'd learned, finally, that some stories aren't meant to end neatly. They fade into the earth, into the water, into the quiet places where truth and myth become the same thing. And in that quiet, the forest waited, patient, endless, and alive, keeping what it was given, holding its secrets beneath the snow until someone else wandered too far and began another story. Because Blue Ridge didn't take people, it remembered them. At its core, the story of Emma Collins and Ryan Porter isn't just about a tragedy in the mountains, it's about the weight of guilt, the fragility of truth, and the way silence can become its own kind of prison. The Blue Ridge Forest, though vast and indifferent, mirrors something deeply human: how we bury our mistakes and call it survival. How we create ghosts out of guilt so we can live with ourselves. Emma's lie wasn't born of malice. It was born of fear, the same fear that drives anyone to hide the worst parts of themselves from the world. In her mind, inventing a monster was easier than admitting she had become one, even for a single, irreversible second. And maybe that's what makes her story so haunting. The monster wasn't out there in the trees, it was inside her all along, wearing her own face. There's a cruel beauty in how the forest functions as both setting and metaphor. It doesn't judge, it simply absorbs what it's given. Every lie, every secret, every drop of blood, Blue Ridge keeps them all without question, folding them into its soil and silence. It's not the villain of the story, though it feels like one. It's more like a mirror reflecting the quiet truths people refuse to confront. For Emma, the forest became both her punishment and her refuge. It hid her when she needed to disappear, but it also held her accountable in its stillness. The longer she stayed, the more she began to hear her own conscience whispering through the wind, until she could no longer tell where the guilt ended and the mountain began. That's the nature of guilt. It echoes. It doesn't die when you confess, it just changes its shape. The tragedy of Emma and Run reminds us how fragile life becomes when emotion overrides reason. It only takes 1 second, a word spoken in anger, a shove in frustration, for a life to split into before and after. Every person who has ever loved deeply knows that fine edge, that thin moment where passion and pain overlap. Emma's fatal mistake wasn't the shove itself, it was the decision to hide afterward, to weave a story that could shelter her from the unbearable truth. Her lie grew roots in the soil, and soon it wasn't just her secret, it became the town's myth, the forest's legend. And when a lie is repeated enough, it stops being a lie, it becomes history. That's the dangerous comfort of storytelling. It can both preserve and distort, heal and wound. The deeper lesson lies in what happens after the confession. When Emma finally told the truth, the world didn't offer her absolution, it offered consequence. But within that punishment there was something quietly redemptive. She learned that forgiveness isn't something given by others. It's something wrestled from within. Her time in the juvenile facility, her endless retellings of the story, her long silence, all of it became a form of penance. Over time, she stopped running from the forest in her mind and started listening to it. That's when her healing began, not by escaping the memory of what she'd done, but by learning to live beside it. Because guilt doesn't disappear when you name it. It simply loses its power to control you. Avery's role in the story gives another layer to the lesson. He's the witness, the one left behind to make sense of what can't be explained. Through him, we see how trauma ripples outward, how those who try to help often carry the same ghosts as those they rescue. His obsession with the truth isn't about solving a mystery, it's about finding meaning in senselessness. And yet, by the end, even he understands that not every story deserves closure. Some stories need to stay unfinished so they can keep teaching us. When Avery finally leaves the forest behind, it's not because he's found peace, it's because he's accepted that peace doesn't come from understanding everything. It comes from knowing when to stop searching. The mountain, too, teaches something profound. Its silence isn't cruelty, it's mercy. It gives people a place to lose themselves, but also a chance to face what they've hidden. Every person who enters those woods brings something broken with them, and the forest doesn't fix them, it just listens. That's what most of us want, deep down, not forgiveness, not erasure, just a place where our pain can exist without being judged. Blue Ridge became that place for Emma. It didn't take her life out of vengeance. It took her back because she finally understood she belonged to it, not as a punishment, but as part of its eternal quiet. The story warns us about the lies we tell to protect ourselves and the way those lies can twist until they consume everything good around us. But it also speaks to the possibility of redemption, however small. Emma didn't escape her guilt, but she transformed it into something enduring, a warning for others. A whisper in the trees reminding anyone who wanders too far that the line between innocence and guilt, between accident and sin, is perilously thin. The mountain didn't forgive her, but it didn't condemn her either. It simply accepted her truth, the way nature always does. For those who live beyond the page, people who have made mistakes, who carry their own hidden regrets, the lesson of Blue Ridge is both devastating and hopeful. It tells us that no one can outwalk what they've done, but they can choose how to live with it. Guilt, if faced honestly, becomes a map back to humanity. Denied, it becomes a labyrinth that never ends. Emma's journey began with denial, but it ended with surrender. In her final act, whether it was vanishing into the forest or simply letting herself disappear from the world, she wasn't running anymore. She was finally standing still, letting the truth catch up to her. And perhaps that's the real message of her story, that some forms of forgiveness don't look like freedom. Sometimes forgiveness looks like silence. It looks like a mountain that refuses to speak, a forest that doesn't give back the dead, a girl who stops asking to be understood. In a world obsessed with explanations and endings, Emma's story leaves us with something rarer: acceptance. The acceptance that tragedy doesn't always need redemption, and that some wounds become part of the landscape of who we are. In the end, the forest remains the keeper of all confessions, the echo chamber of what people can't say aloud. It stands as a quiet reminder that truth always finds its way back, no matter how deep we bury it, because the Blue Ridge, like guilt itself, never forgets. It listens, it waits, and sometimes, if you stand still long enough, it forgives not by absolving you, but by letting you disappear into its peace. That's the final lesson, that we are all a little like Emma Collins, lost somewhere between what we've done and who we still hope to be. Walking through the woods of our own making, hoping that the silence will love us anyway. The darkness doesn't end here. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let me take you deeper into things not everyone dares to face.